Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce the American Dialect Society professor. For a number of years now, the American Dialect Society has sponsored a professor at the Linguistic Institute. Past ADS professors include such distinguished scholars as Walt Wolfram, Dennis Preston, Sally Palemonte, Kirk Hazen, and many others. Tonight, it's my honor to introduce the latest scholar to join that list of luminaries, Professor Patricia Cukor-Avila of the University of North Texas. Now, I'm especially pleased to introduce my fellow ADS member for a number of reasons. First, like all of our faculty and students at UC Davis, she's an Aggie, although of a different kind. She received her BA and MA in Spanish from Texas A&M University before going on to the University of Michigan for a PhD in linguistics. Second, in all my sociolinguistics courses, I tell students that sociolinguistics is not a spectator sport, right? Rather, it involves going into communities and collecting real language as it's used by real people in their everyday lives. And in that respect, no one exemplifies sociolinguistics as active participation better than Patricia Cukor-Avila and her research partner of many years, and my former boss, Guy Bailey. He was my dean and provost at the University of Texas at San Antonio. In fact, they hold the record for a longitudinal study. Their study of Springville, Texas, a small, mostly African-American town in East Texas, now spans more than 30 years. This work has resulted in a number of seminal papers, including Rural Texas African-American Vernacular English, Sanjo Einhardt's Oxford Handbook of African-American Language. Real and Apparent Time in the Handbook of Language Variation and Change. Some Structural Consequences of Diffusion, a major article in Language and Society, and Verbs of Quotation over Time in African-American Vernacular English, which was published a few years ago in American Speech. And many, many others. Not only has this work shed light on the nature of African-American English in the South, where the dialect, in fact, developed, but in tracing a language variety for more than a generation of real time, it's enabled us to really better understand language change. Now, given her outstanding record, I was especially pleased when Professor Cukor-Avila proposed to teach a course in sociolinguistic field methods here at the Institute, an area in which she is without peer. And you don't have to take my word for it. Bill Above has written that she has accomplished, and I quote, the greatest body of fieldwork that has been done in our field. I'm sure that her students and colleagues here and all who read her work will agree, not only about the quality of the fieldwork, but about the insightfulness of the analysis. Please welcome my friend, my colleague, Professor Patricia Cukor-Avila.
So I'm just really excited to be here, to have the opportunity to share the past 3 decades of my life with you, sort of like what I did on my summer vacation for 30 years, right? But I'm not going to show you daily vacation photos. I'm going to show you photos of the field site here and some of the people that I worked with for all this time. And but before I begin, of course, this is the end of the Institute. I'm standing between you and the reception, so all right. But I'm really so happy, and I'm going to give a huge shout out to the co-directors. What happened? Oh, there she is. We moved. Raul in Georgia, right? I mean, let's. Is it okay if I stand back here? I don't want to do this, right? Should I go closer to this? Oh, I have to do that. and down, down. Okay, thank you. And then the incredible staff, right? Chloe. You out there taking pictures or running a video camera or something?
He's on his way. He's coming. He's on his
He'll
way.
be here soon, right? Yeah. Like in class. Right. That's a normal behavior. Kristen and Michelle and Jesse, and I probably left out some people. So a little secret, this is the first institute I've been to since 1987 when I was 5. So anyway, so I'm so happy to be here, and I shouldn't have waited so long to come back, but I'm really, really thankful, and especially thankful to the ADS nominating committee, which consists of Bob Bailey, who you saw, and Sanja Lanehart and Sally Tagliamonte, who nominated me for this professorship. So I'm really, thank you very much for that as well. It's been great. And I will never, forget this, obviously. So, I don't want to take too long to explain the pictures, but you can see they have dates on them. Many of the people in these photos, let's see if this works so far. It does. So a lot of these kids are the same ones that you're going to see in these pictures here. So just to give you a perspective, this girl here is the girl here in blue, right? And this is her daughter, and this is her daughter here. So I've got a lot of generations here. And I don't want to spend too much time going over these, but I have a lot of photos like this. So let's move on, and let's see what I'm going to talk about tonight. So what I want to do, I'm going to do 2 parts. I'm going to talk about the project and the field work, and then I'm going to give you some background on why we chose Springville as a community to look at. Talk about the ethno-linguistic approach to the field work, do some summary. You're going to hear a lot of recordings of small samples from the different interview contexts that we have in the study. And then the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about a short linguistic analysis, focusing on 2 innovative features. We're going to look at them in real and apparent time, and I'm going to talk about how this data can help solve the actuation problem and transmission confusion. And don't worry if you're not a sociolinguist, I'll explain what all that jargon means, right? Okay. So I would like to acknowledge the initial fieldwork was funded. Guy Bailey received NSF grants to get me out there to do the fieldwork. And then the follow-up fieldwork was supported through various universities where we were, or where I was. And then, of course, the people from Springville themselves, my friends, really not the people who are not my subjects, right? And they've generously given all of their time to us all these years, and we're still in contact with them. So, this wouldn't be possible without them. All right, so let's get started. So, as Bob said, the project is on the longest. My notes are over here. Can everybody hear me okay? The longest running studies in quantitative sociolinguistics. So the exploratory fieldwork was done in 86, 87, and then the project began in the summer of 88. That's when I went out there and spent almost every day out there. And the most recent fieldwork, we were in the community in September of 2018, and I'll be going down there in about a month. Guy and I are going to go down and do some more fieldwork. We've got a few people we want to talk to. So we said it was over at ADS, but it's not really over. I won't let it be over. Anyway, so the informants were born as early as 1893 and as late as 2002, and it provides an apparent time perspective of more than a century, right? And so when you combine this with mechanically recorded data that we have from the WPA former slave recordings, which were made before World War II, and many of them were from around that area where we've done our field work, we have a real-time window that expands to more than 3/4 of a century, and the apparent time window to more than a century and a half. Okay. So it's situated squarely within the synchronic approach to language change, and the project was originally conceived to address a number of issues involving African American vernacular English, which I'll just refer to as AAVE, and methods for studying both AAVE and language change. And these issues include field methods for addressing the observer's paradox and other field worker effects. The development of this variety over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and its evolving relationship with Southern white vernaculars, the possibility of age grading for some of the features, the mechanisms of innovation, and the mechanisms of linguistic diffusion, especially from urban to rural areas. So let's talk a little bit about the community. So it was chosen as a research site. Notice it's Figaro Cotton there, but that's not unfamiliar for people from here, right? It was chosen as a research site because it was typical of the kind of community where people in the Lower South lived between 1880 and 1940. So it's not a unique community at all. It's similar to hundreds of other communities that were, dotted all around the South. And really the only thing unusual about it is that the community persisted, the lifestyle persisted as long as it did. And that was mainly due because the general store owner sort of kept things the way it was. So when I first went there, I felt like I was stepping back in time. So it was a real education for me. And the store stood at the center of the community, and I'll talk more about that. So rural communities organized around general stores were central to the system of farm tenancy that lay at the heart of the economic and social structure of the Lower South between 1880 and World War II. So the stores served as post offices, as middlemen between bankers and tenant farmers, and as the credit-based crop lien system that dominated the Cotton South. They were also gathering places and centers of social and linguistic interaction in rural communities. So they were the primary places where the African Americans and whites interacted publicly. And because of their centrality to the economic and social structure of the Lower South before World War II, understanding communities like Springville is really crucial to understanding the evolution of Black and white vernaculars in the South during the course of the late 19th and early and mid-20th centuries. So since the mid-20th century, Springville has maintained a stable population of around 150 to 170. It's really fertile farmland, so it's not a location where they would have developments, housing developments there. So although the demographic makeup has historically been about 70% African American, with the rest divided among Mexican Americans and Anglos, recently a number of whites have moved into some adjacent areas into the community, or communities adjacent to Springville. So the social situation during this time also remained fairly stable. Beginning the last 2 decades of the 19th century and continuing through the 20th century, the general store and post office played a major role in the lives of the residents there. And like other general stores dotted throughout the South, the rural South, the Springville store was the economic and social center of the community. So it served the personal and financial needs, basically birth to death. I mean, you could buy coffins there if you needed them. You could also buy food, clothing, tools, seed, hardware. That's where residents went and cashed their checks, paid bills. They bought things on credit. It was really interesting. So this was sort of the financial center of the community. So let me show you a few photos of what we have here. Just very briefly, if you look in the store here, you can see the front of the store that's in the top left-hand corner, and inside over on the top right-hand corner here. These are just some older gentlemen. The mail used to come around 11:30, and so people would come in early and hang out and wait for the mail because that was a big deal. And then when they got their mail, as you can see here, they open it and then look at it, whatever little mail they got. The store itself, you can see on the bottom left, and inside from back to front is the middle picture. And on the far right, or bottom right, is what was commonly called the beer joint. That's not my name, that's what the community called it. And you can see this was another site that we would record in, and if you look very closely, the person sitting with his feet propped up there, that's a guy 30 years ago, with brown hair, with hair, I should say. Okay. I still have my hair, but he doesn't. Okay, and so here's some photos of around the community. So the top left-hand corner, the owner of the store, that house was her parents' home. It was commonly referred to in town as the big house. It looks like an old-style Southern plantation home, not in the best repair, as you can see, although since that time it's been painted, I think. That's just cotton. And then the tenant farmhouses that dotted the fields, you can see, and these were homes. Let me just get my little clicker here. One here, here's another one, and here's another one. These were homes that the store owner owned, and then she would lease or rent them to people for about, I don't know, anywhere between $30 and $50 a month. So pretty cheap, but they weren't the greatest either. And then the bottom right-hand corner is the New Zion Baptist Church. This was commonly referred to as the Black Church because only the African Americans went there. There was another church across the railroad tracks that was where the Spanish-speaking residents of the community went, commonly referred to as the Spanish Church, right? Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about the field work. So as with most sociolinguistic corpora, the corpus includes recordings of individuals and peer groups. That's common in our field. What distinguishes the fieldwork, however, from other projects are two things: so the use of site study recordings that I'll talk about today, and these were done mainly at the store and a couple other places. And then multiple recordings in a variety of contexts with participants, many of whom had been recorded for the entirety of the project, so there's repeated recordings in different contexts. And so at present, it includes a little over 2 million words, transcribed word for word by me. I'm pretty good on the old transcription here. Not software, by the way. Not including the recordings that we just made last year. We were there in March and September, and I haven't even gotten to those yet. So let's look here. This ought to look familiar to you, Barbara, this picture here. So I began the fieldwork with individual interviews. So these interviews supplied substantial linguistic data and provided opportunities to learn about the community, get to know the residents, discover and map relationships among the residents, obtain their permission to be recorded, of course, and then get leads on other residents who might be interviewed. So it was really like a snowball sampling that I did, right? Friend of a friend, comma, snowball sample. Just as LaBeouf did, we looked for opportunities to create context within the individual interviews that provided spontaneous speech. So for example, doing interviews outdoors on porches or front yards. And remember, this is Texas in the summer, so outside was actually cooler than inside. So it really created many opportunities for third-party intrusions, as in the first example I'm about to play for you. So that was the thing about the third-party intrusion. So this was taken from an interview that I did when I first started my fieldwork in July 1988 with a woman who I'll call Mary, and she was born in 1912. Now, Wilson, who was born a year later in 1913, was a local farmer, and he had this amazing garden. And so he'd go around and sell his fruits and vegetables to people in the community. So he stopped by because Mary had asked him to bring some cream peas. And if you don't know what they are, ask Dennis, he'll tell you what they are. Right? I learned about cream peas, and I learned how to shell them, too. And so he comes in, and now he becomes part of the conversation, which you'll see. So it was interesting because now we have a third-party intrusion, but also the first day I met him, for some reason he took a liking to me, and after that we were able to record him several times, and then later on you'll hear an interview where he invited me over for his special homemade barbecue. Those were the days before I stopped eating meat. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to play this for you, and this was recorded on Mary's front porch.
That's why you don't talk so fast. We're going to take it up once he talks.
That's okay.
Well, I think so. Come on. Now who's he? Your friend here? Yes, he is. Yeah. With you today, I think so. How are you? Oh, fine. Fine. To my name?
Okay, my name is Patricia.
Like to God, Miss Patricia. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Excuse me, stepping over there.
We're talking about, well, just about everything.
Well, if you wanted us, I need to tell you a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I just tell you that.
Oh, yeah.
I brought you the keys if you want. Oh, you did? They're clean, that's what you said. Yeah.
Would you like to see? Why don't you take a seat here?
No, move that and sit down.
Are you sure?
Move those things and sit down right there. I had it back because I got some more folks up. You got some more peas. I picked 3 bushes this morning.
Ooh.
She had a half bush already before I got the flavor. Oh, boy.
So do you live at her too?
Just across the road. I'm over here, they think I live here. Oh, right. He has his own garden and he raises all kind of vegetables and stuff. So I told him when he gets some peas to bring me some. But this stuff, I mean, they make it too. Really? I live right where they show.
What else do you raise besides peas?
Well, I raise peaches, plum, pear, grapes. I got all that grape. I got to pick them. Try to get them off with the bud and them up. Sure, yeah.
You can tell I was trained as a dialectologist first, right? When you raise in your garden. Okay, so what most distinguished the approach to individual interviews in Springville was a commitment to do multiple interviews with residents. So for instance, during that same summer of 1988, Mary was interviewed 3 times. Wilson, the man you just heard, was interviewed 5 times, and Vanessa, who you're about to hear, was interviewed 5 times, and all in multiple contexts. The commitment to multiple interviews was in part a result of our understanding of the effects of familiarity on data from linguistic interviews. So we know that the initial interview with someone really, is pretty formal. And so it typically doesn't yield the kind of unmonitored speech that we try to get in our field, right? And so we want to try and get what the kind of speech they're using with their peers. But as we became more familiar with the Springville residents, then the subsequent interviews typically revealed increasingly casual speech. So I'm going to play two samples back to back. The first one was recorded in same month, July of 1988. In fact, it was July 12th, and there's a reason why I give you that specific date. And then the second text was done a week later on the 19th. And so I just, kind of look at the difference. So you'll note that the first one follows sort of the simple question answer. I don't know her, so I'm trying to get information from her. And then the second text I'll play, the 1 week later, shows that it's a little bit increasing familiarity, right? So she provides an intimate personal information, and she even shares confidential details about the problems of another community resident. So let's go ahead and listen to this first text. Maybe.
What time to start with? Like, what time do you work? I come at 8 and get off at 4:30. So what do your kids do while they are home? What do they do during the daytime when they're not at
Well,
school?
they just got out of summer school, and they haven't been doing too much everything, laying around, watching TV and fussing and fighting and hollering over here for me.
Yeah, you can hear them, I bet, huh?
Yeah.
So what kind of stuff do they fight over? Let me see that. Tell me who's the oldest, boy or girl?
Girl,
And then the next one is
just the boy and the girl.
So who fights with who?
It mostly be the baby fighting the oldest girl. She jealous. She always wants things to go her way.
Mhm.
When it don't, she want to fight.
Mhm.
So it's the baby always want to fight.
So what about the boy? Does he play referee?
Yeah, he do. He's like the man of the house. He watch over them. When they get to fussing too much, he get on. He keeps them in order.
Her kids that she's talking about, if you remember the first slide where they were in the top left-hand corner, those little kids. All right, so now let's listen to the second text recorded 1 week.
What about a lot of your girlfriends? Have they been married and divorced, or are they married or single and what?
Most of them have been married and divorced. And me, see, after I got 18, she come to live with me and my mom. And we just like sisters.
Where's she from?
She's from Abilene.
And so what brought her down here?
Her and her mama couldn't get along. And mama always been the type that take in kids.
She told me that.
Yeah, she take in kids and stuff. See, she's not my real mother, but she raised me ever since I was 6 years old.
6 years old.
So, that's all I know as a mother. And after I could get along with her papa, she come to stay with us. And so we got along as sisters. And she haven't got married either. So,
Does she have a boyfriend?
yeah, she has about, she been with 5 years. She haven't got married.
She have any kids?
She got a little girl. See, a while back she got sick and she ran off.
Now who's this? Okay.
She ran off. Don't let me do this.
No, it's okay.
She ran off and she left the little girl because she couldn't handle it. Between the boyfriend and work and problems, she just needed to get away, so she did. And after she ran off, then her mother came and got her, and they took her back to Abilene. And by her being here, there, and everywhere, the boy mother took her, and she's raising her.
Oh, I see.
It's better though, and plus she got a better living than she had, the baby did. So it's better for the baby.
Okay, so throughout the 1980s and 1990s, I remained in touch with Vanessa on a regular basis with few gaps in contact. And during that time, I also recorded several conversations with her. Because of my regular and continuing contact, I was able to establish a level of familiarity with her that led to a level of interaction more typical of things you'd have between friends, people who know each other, than between field workers and informants. So I'm going to play one more sample from Vanessa, text 4, where she tells me about a time her daughter snuck out of the house. And this was done in 1997.
So when
So there's a kid in the background.
I can't, but you do. That's been 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. It was coming, like when we get off work here, come out here and see her. And I told her I didn't even want to come out here because I'm tired of them fussing, I'm tired of them arguing. I just don't want to deal with it no more. And I said, if you really want, you'll get a place and put it in it. Because I can't deal with y'all, no. I said, you stay out there with your mom and she can stay out there with us. So let that be. Did she say she come back? She sneaked out last night. She did. She got this phone call. And so, that was I didn't go to sleep about 2 after we left. And it was like, I was watching Jerry Springer about 1 time. And in the phone rung, she answered, I said, you know, put her on a pan. I said, where you going this time? I'll be right back, we're just going outside. I don't even know what time she come back, because it was 2. And then came at that time and knocked on the door. It scared us for somebody to come to our house that night. And he said, you know, they get the phone and call the police. And I said, did you see? He said, yeah. He said, some man in a red car, brown skin, tall man, who don't know about a phone. I said, she didn't even tell us nothing. She just took off.
Which she did a lot, actually. All right, let's move on. So let's talk about the peer group interviews. For more than half a century, sociolinguists have placed special value on interviews with peer groups, in part because group interviews can shift the fieldworker's interlocutor role from addressee to auditor. Peer group interviews in sociolinguistics have been done most often with adolescents, although we know the work that Walt Wolfram did in Ocracoke used also adult peer group interviews as well. So since changing the interlocutor role of the fieldworker to help ameliorate the negative effects of the observer's paradox was a primary goal of our project, engaging as many of the residents as possible, including adults of all ages, in peer group interviews became a crucial component of the Springville project. So remember Wilson that was selling the cream peas? Well, after I met him, we recorded him on individual interviews, and then, like I mentioned, he invited us to come over because he kept telling us how great he made barbecue, and he wanted us to have dinner with him. Dinner meaning the noon meal. So when we arrived, we found that he had also invited one of his very close friends who was born the same year he was, 1913. So of course, for a field worker, that's just amazing, right? Suddenly we have another guy here, and we didn't even invite him. And so what happened was that after we ate, we went out on the front porch and sat there, and these guys just talked for like 2 hours, reminiscing about everything in their lives. Now, I'm going to play a small sample for you here, and you're going to hear a distinct hum in the background, because as all field workers, I made some mistakes. And so, well, you haven't seen it yet, you will at the end of the presentation, but I wasn't using digital technology in 1988, right? I was using a Sony TCM 5000, which some of you old people may know what that is, right? It actually had cassettes in it, which half the room probably doesn't know what that is. And so, I have no place to put the mic but on top of the tape recorder. Well, guess what? It recorded the mechanism of the tape going, and the thing. So you'll hear this, so you can't do any phonological analysis of this, but you can hear it. So here's boo-boo number like 10 or something in my fieldwork. But in any case, you can still hear what he says. And his friend talks a little low, but I'll try and move the volume up so you can hear it better.
I don't know what Jesse made good money. You know, every time you pay that $175, you pay that to him cash. So that's what I paid him when he doesn't know how to pay $175. So I guess I don't have to somebody else to him now. I didn't go get him into the stand for him. And what he do, I don't know. You know, I'm trying to find out. You come here and bring him over. Why no, man, you said me all that trouble. I told him, I got him on to the department. I said, Jackie, I don't mind you come here with me. I'm trying to get my wife and I'm sick. See, I'm still over here cutting and making that old stuff. poetry. And I said, I'm gonna tell you something, I appreciate you coming in. But no way. You're gonna bring it still welcome, sir. Ain't nothing like this.
I don't think.
I don't care.
The reason I told you,
I don't like it. And I don't work nobody's house, bro. I don't want nobody coming around.
that's right. However you come down, you find me just like that. I don't like that stuff. If you pay that, you bring them trouble, please, you got that, don't make me. We can get along. Don't you leave out that road, I don't make life. But you come in with it, I tell them about that. I tell them all, that's what we're doing all right there. I don't bite my tongue.
Okay, let's move on to the site studies. So this represents a strategy, like I mentioned, for ameliorating the observer's paradox by focusing on the speech used at sites of linguistic interaction over a given period of time, and not specifically on the speech of individuals at the site. So making the store the focal point of fieldwork arose quite naturally from the interactions, because I would meet people there, so I would hang out at the store a lot, and it was the only place to get something to eat or drink, so I was there. So soon the interviews became closely intertwined with the day-to-day business of the store and included a wide range of unsolicited linguistic interactions, including teasing, arguments, jokes, business transactions, and just routine conversations that make up much of the community's linguistic activity. So I began going to the store on a regular basis, not to record people, individuals there, but actually just to sit there, and then when people came in, I was able to do these site studies. And many of the people in them, of course, had already been interviewed previously. So by focusing on the site rather than the individual, we were able to shift the interlocutor role of the field worker from addressing to auditor, sometimes even to overhear, a role that, if we assume Bell's audience design model, is substantially less likely to influence the speech of participants. So overhear, I get up and leave and maybe go outside or use the restroom, and then the taper would still be going. So now I'm going to play you a short excerpt from a longer conversation in which Slim pushes Rupert, who walks into the store. I was talking to Slim, and then Rupert comes in, and he wants to get him to tell me the way he can see ghosts, because Rupert says that he can see ghosts. So let's listen. And this is a much longer narrative, but I'm only going to play a short part for you.
She teaches school and she's going to get her doctor's now.
In what subject?
You know, I was down to one time and back on the I forgot. She like
Morning.
Hello, little man. Man, I seen that little man that time. What? I seen that little man that time. What about? Right down here? Oh, he's traveling. Where do you go? I don't know. That little man, you know, can you see those?
Ghosts? Well, I've never seen one.
You can see them.
Can you really?
This little man is passing around, little short man, that's the cigarettes and things.
Just about this now. Follow me one night, man. Right over there. Move to that.
Seriously?
Oh,
You can tell me that, and I didn't believe that at first, you know.
I didn't see it. I gotta tell you the job. There's no stuff. I went back. I turned around there, like you know that. What's your name? You better tell me your name. I said, come on,
And it goes on. It's a pretty interesting narrative. So as the interviews continued over a period of several years, it became apparent that the Springbrook project offered an opportunity for a panel survey within the broader scope of the project, since we had a stable core of residents spanning a wide age range who could be re-interviewed. So table 1 here shows the panel survey embedded within the larger project. It currently includes 18 African Americans, some 30% of the total. So the decades of birth of these people in the panel range from 1912 to 2002, and both the length of time they remained in the panel and the frequency with which they were interviewed. That's each of those crosses that's in the boxes there. And then, of course, the last column where it says status, that obviously you can kind of figure that out. Those towns are pseudonyms for where they're living. So let's see. So 5 of the 18 panelists have died during, as you can see, during the 31-year span of the project. In fact, one of the women we just talked to in September just passed away a couple of weeks ago. So I'm really glad I got to see her. let's see, 3 who were born after the initial fieldwork, they're on the bottom, we added them to the panel, that's why there's the blue squares there. And then one of the informants moved out of the area and was unavailable for interviews after 2002. So just a brief summary of the data we've gathered from the corpus of interviews along with some of the analysis. So to date, we've extracted and coded a little over 5,500 third singular present tense forms from a total of almost 17,000 present tense verbs. For those of you who know about this variety, this is one of the features that's studied quite often is present tense marking. We've also got 9,800 deletable present tense copula forms from a total of close to 23,000 present tense forms. That's listed a lot of data. Over 1,000 tokens of habitual and variant B. And you can see samples here. And then also we've got 4,700 quotative forms, including almost 600 tokens of quotative B-like. So this is really interesting. So the use of quotative B-like by speakers born after 1970, I'm going to play a little sample here, so I mean everybody's familiar with it, but I just wanted you to hear it. And so this is when Brandy's telling me, and Brandy is Vanessa's daughter, younger daughter, telling me about when she missing her high school reunions. I asked her, don't you ever have high school reunions? And here's what she started to tell me.
And I was in the city training, and I saw this guy that I used to go to school with. He was like, "Why didn't you come to the reunion?" I was like, "What reunion?" You know, he's like, "We didn't stay out to the reunion." And I was like, "I didn't know he had a job." I was like, "I didn't know anything about it." They had it, and I didn't even know they had it. And I told him, I was like, "You know, next time." Next time, y'all, I'll be let me know, because I didn't even know that they had it.
Okay, so some other things we've studied. We've also been able to track the grammaticalization of had plus past used as a single past tense form, and you may have noticed some of those in the excerpts I've been playing. Demonstrate that ambiguous tense marking has led to innovations in AAVE, and most recently I've begun a project with my students, which I started with my socio class last semester, to do a replication study on the use of general extenders by Springville AAVE speakers. There's a lot of work on general extenders, but nothing on African American English, so I thought it'd be interesting to look there. I've also been able to substantiate Leboeuf's claim that historical present is not used in the narratives of AAVE speakers. So I'm going to play an example because I love this narrative so much, and Bobby is the most gifted storyteller. And this is about a snake he found in his garden. He's very afraid of snakes, by the way, even though he's a rural person. He eats snakes. Okay.
I think we gotta think about watering flowers. I was standing there watering flowers. And all of a sudden I saw about that much snake behind this flower bed. And I looked at it, you know, you have to sit there and you have to think through it. You got to figure out where to live, behind live, where to go. So
I know where to go.
It was all that right there. And I looked and I said, and his head was so big, I said, man, if his head is this big, and right here is that big, it's got to be a whole bunch back there. I took off, jumped across the table, went across another table, jumped to that little artificial door I got, and ran over to that other, whatever 500 stands little thing here. Picked up a hoe, shovel, came back, on my way back, I ran over a big cat. I grabbed my cat, walked up to the chicken snake was like 5.5 feet long. And this thing was just like that big. And he just standing there, you know, just sitting down there looking funny. So when I came back, he was gone. But he had bathed over there on that little stream. I had some flowers over there, some bougainvilleas and some pot. And he had bathed, got up in there and grew it up. And I walked up there with the cat. And I told him that cat on that snake. So that cat had my hand. In mid-air after that. That's out of that. I said, now I thought a cat's supposed to kill a thing. And I sit there and I said, now what to do? And I got the shovel and I come back and I ran around and I spear and I cut him in half. And that cat was like, I mean, he was just like, just looking hard. And I kept on every time the snake would jump in. And when I got to the cat walked over to the snake, convicted. You never said that.
That's my favorite coda of all times, right? It's like the perfect narrative. And he's got dozens of narratives like this. He loves to tell stories. All right, so the longitudinal focus of the Springville study coupled with the panel survey data provided an opportunity for us to use the results from our analysis to contribute to the work on fundamental issues in language variation and change. So these include linguistic change over the lifespan, the relationship between the transmission and diffusion of linguistic features, the actuation of linguistic change, the effect of gaps in contact on the results, and the number of tokens of a linguistic feature needed for making valid inferences about linguistic behavior regarding that feature. So in the rest of the talk, I will discuss data on 2 innovative features in Springville from our recent study on, this works, the motivation for linguistic change, and which also includes an overview of how the mechanisms of transmission and diffusion, good, it worked, are not as straightforward in Springville as they have been described in other communities. So, in what was perhaps the first full articulation of the synchronic approach to language change, Weinrock et al. Argued that the process of language change could best be understood by resolving 5 fundamental problems, right? These are the transition problem, the constraints problem, the embedding problem, the evaluation problem, and the actuation problem. So in what was perhaps, So in the 5th problem, the actuation problem has proved more challenging, however. So according to Weinrock, Labov, and Herzog, the actuation problem addresses the following question. Why do changes in a structural feature take place in a particular language at a given time, but not in other languages with the same feature or in the same language at other times? So few answers to this question exist. So the difficulty in addressing the actuation problem lies in the kinds of data that are available for tracking it. So both trend and survey and apparent time data, or trend survey and apparent time data, are appropriate for resolving the transition, the constraints, embedding, and evaluation problems, especially if they come from research designed to address those issues, right? But neither, however, can identify either the precise onset of a change or the factors that led to its emergence. So using data from Springville panel survey, we've begun to address the actuation problem by examining the development of 2 linguistic changes that emerged during the 20th century. So the first is habitual invariant B. It's an incremental change that evolved over the course of the first half of the 20th century, but did not become fully entrenched in the vernacular until the last quarter of the century, at least in this particular village. The second, quotative B-like, which we're all familiar with, rapidly diffused into Springville during the last decade of the 20th century and became an integral part of the vernacular during the first decade of the 21st century. So the panel survey also demonstrates how the second change, the B-like, builds on the architecture of the first, invariant B, to create a structure that is both shared with much of the English-speaking world, but is also unique in its realization. So one of the most salient grammatical features of AAVE during the last half of the 20th century is the use of the uninflected B to refer to present habitual contexts. Before adjectives, as in example 1, locatives, as in example 2, and especially before present participles, as in number 3. Although invariant B has been documented in AAV since its beginnings, in pre-20th century varieties it occurred primarily as a result of will-would deletion, one of a series of auxiliary deleted processes, as in number 4, and less frequently as an alternative for copula, for am, is, and are, as in example 5. Okay. So the evolution of invariant B as a marker of habituality in the present tense, however, is a 20th century development. The cross-sectional survey data from Springville analyzed in apparent time clearly shows that this evolution took place in 3 stages. So here is stage 1, which involved the expansion of invariant B not derived from will-would deletion. B not derived from will-would deletion, and that's the purple line in this figure. Okay? So as the purple line shows, in the mechanically recorded data from former slaves, the majority of which I mentioned come from that area, deleted will-would accounts for almost 3/4 of the tokens of invariant B. You can see right here. So during the course of the 20th century, invariant B not derived from will-would deletion, the orange line, this one right there, so that's B as an alternative form for am, is, and are. expands rapidly as a proportion of the invariant B tokens, so that's what that line represents. So that during the period right before World War II, it accounts for more than half of the invariant B tokens. Here, right? And by the 1960s, almost a little over 90%. Okay? So, as invariant B used as an alternative form for am and is and are expands, it becomes increasingly restricted to habitual contexts. So this is stage 2, the semantic restriction, right? Shown by the blue line in figure 2, and that's why I grayed out the orange line so you don't look at that one. And it indicates the percent of B used in place of am, is, and are, and that's the orange line. So blue is the percent of that that's used in habitual contexts. None of the tokens of invariant B used for am, is, and are by the former slaves has a habitual meaning. And in the early decades of the 20th century, habitual contexts account for only about 15%, as you can see here, of the tokens of this form. By World War II, though, habitual contexts account for over half of the uses, and by the 1960s, again, about 80% or so. The third stage are the syntactic restrictions. So this is shown by the green line in figure 3 here. So this indicates the percent of habitual invariant B forms that precede ing verbs. None of the tokens of invariant B used by the former slaves precede these ing verbs. And in the early decades of the 20th century, less than 10% here of the tokens do. But by the middle of the century, though half do, and by the 1960s, nearly 2/3 do. By the last quarter of the 20th century, then, the grammatical reanalysis of invariant B in Springville is complete. What was once simply an occasional alternative for a copula form used in place of am, is, and are has become a marker of habituality in the present tense, used primarily as an auxiliary before ing verbs, and to a much lesser extent as a copula before locative and adjective forms. The panel survey data from the Springville Project provide unique insights into how invariant habitual B was transmitted from generation to generation, and into how its evolution helped create the architecture that differentiates the quotative B like in Springville from other reported uses of the form. So a basic assumption underlying the transmission of changes, such as invariant B, is that they are passed along incrementally from generation to generation in a relatively straightforward way. This is what Labov has called incremental change. However, the intergenerational transmission of habitual invariant B in Springville was more complex. So in this figure, so in the panel survey, because we've talked about child-rearing patterns, so I just want to just briefly touch on this here. So remember I mentioned that Vanessa mentioned that Mary had raised her. But she also raised, this is the other girl she was talking about. And then these 3 kids in red are Vanessa's natural children, but she also raised Samantha, who happens to be Erica's child. And so if you think about it, and here they're here because these kids lived with their grandmother for a while. So when invariant B was coming in, they weren't getting it because, remember, look when she was born, she doesn't have habitual invariant B before ing. So it's not being transmitted in that straightforward way that Labov talks about. So it skips a generation, so they've got to get it from somewhere, right? So it's unlikely, like I said, that they acquired habitual invariant B from those who were raising them. But, rather that the adolescents and young teenagers born in the 70s and 80s, with the kids I just showed you, seem to have acquired it from their peers, right? As their peer networks expanded outside Springville into nearby urban areas, especially when they left and went to school to go to a small city about 9 or 10 miles away. At the time we were doing our field work, up until the early 1990s, children had to leave after 8th grade to attend high school in a neighboring community. And this was considered urban, even though the population was about 2,500. But the vernacular was a lot different there, and they would pick up forms there. At least that's what our hypothesis, right? So if we look at figure 5, this illustrates the point by showing that the increase in the frequency of habitual invariant B for 2 of the girls, Sheila and Brandy, who were sisters, coincides with when they left the community, this pre-urban, right, and developed their extensive urban ties. For Sheila, it was when she actually dropped out of school when she was about 14, and for Brandy, this was when she started the 9th grade, and Brandy did graduate from high school, just as a point of fact. All right, so for much of the second half of the 20th century then, it seems that habitual invariant B was reintroduced to each generation as speakers developed urban networks outside of Springville. So by the last decade of the 20th century, Springville children were being raised by caregivers who had individual and variant B. Remember now, Brandy has her kids and she has this form, okay? And so, so it was a part of their vernacular from the start, so now we have transmission. So it was transmitted to them as children. So in spite of the complex transmission, by the last quarter of the 20th century, habitual and variant B was an integral part of the Springville copula auxiliary system that already included zero copula, which apparently, from what we've seen, has been part of AAV since the beginnings and was robust in Springville even with the oldest residents. So the copula auxiliary system included two features not present in most varieties of English, that's zero and invariant B, and a unique structural configuration with habituals marked by invariant B. So although the apparent time data from Springville confirms this scenario, the panel survey data from the Springville project gives little insight into actuation proposed for invariant B, since the form developed before the last quarter of the 20th century, so we don't have panel survey data for invariant B. That's why we can't really get the actuation. But what it does provide is unique insights into how it was transmitted from generation to generation in the rural communities, and also how its evolution helped create a construction that differentiates quotative B like in Springville from what's reported in uses of the form elsewhere. So, unique structural configuration of habitual invariant B provided a structural host for the expansion of quotative B like into Springville that made the morphosyntax of these quotatives unlike any construction reported in the rapidly expanding momentous literature, right, on this feature. Tagliamonte et al. In 2016 suggests that quotative B-like emerged in English varieties at about the same time, people born in the 1950s. It became increasingly more frequent in the speech of people born in the 1970s, or I didn't say 50s, I meant 60s. Became more frequent in people born in the 1970s, and then by the time speakers were born in the 1980s, B-like had basically replaced say as the primary quotative form of their speech, and you all are thinking, do I use this? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? Their data from 4 geographically distinct locales show parallel trajectories for the diffusion of B-like in the speech of adolescents and young adults. So it's become a primary verb of quotation for Springville AV speakers as well. However, the diffusion into the community occurred approximately 2 decades later than what has been reported in other studies, and you can see that here in a figure I've reproduced from my article from 2012 that Bob was talking about. So the apparent time data from the cross-sectional figure study in figure 6 shows that the shift in the quotative system where B-like begins to replace say actually doesn't take place until way over here around the 90s, right? And so these kids get it, and then it becomes part of it. It overcomes say in their speech, and they're about late teens, early 20s. This panel survey provide a unique perspective both on when and how the quotative B-like diffused in the community, on the transmission of the form, and its continued expansion in the speech of panelists born after the 1990s. So let's take a quick look at this figure here, which includes data from 2 speakers, Sheila and Brandy, across their lifespan, and shows that the use of B-like in their speech was minimal when they were in their early teens, increased as they got older, and at the time their social networks began to extend out of Springville, it gets greater in their speech. So it really didn't become a primary part of their quotative system until both of them are past their teens and well into adulthood. Well, let's contrast this with the adolescents who were born in the 1990s, their cousins, Tina and Keisha. So by the time these girls were in their early teens, B-like was well established as their primary verb of quotation. And they were the ones that also went to the new school that was built there too. So we suggest that major changes in the demographics of the school figure into the diffusion of B-like in Springville. And I'm going to show you those right now. So when Sheila and Brandy left the school in the mid-1990s, there were over 3 times as many African American as Anglo students. And figure 9 shows these demographics here for you. The school, it changed dramatically as the total population increased over time from a low, when we first started our work, of a total of 60 students from pre-K to 8th grade into the most recent figures that I got for 2018, I believe. They have almost 600 students in the school now, and it goes through the 12th grade. It's also A lot has changed, and it's a blue ribbon school, so things are really different there. By the time Tina and Keisha were teenagers, the African American population was below 10%, and there were almost 6 times as many Hispanic students and 4 times as many Anglo students. These are all coming from outside, so it's sort of they're coming into the school because it's perceived as a better school district than where they live. Further, almost like I said, all over outside of Springville. So our analysis reveals a correlation between the rapid expansion of Code of Be Like and the change in the demographic makeup of the school, and strongly suggests that the school was the primary agency for the diffusion of Be Like into the youngest generation of Springville residents, because remember their parents, Vanessa doesn't use this form at all. Adolescents coming from the surrounding areas almost likely brought the form with them into the Springville school, and then the school became the mechanism for the diffusion of Code of Be Like to the rural adolescents. So the panel study data also provides evidence that as young Springville speakers began to use Code of Be Like, they simultaneously adapted into their existing AAVE tense aspect system. And as a result, it occurs with the full range of AAV copula forms, and is R, 0, and B, as you can see in these examples here. So, we know that it's used with 0 copula as an example 1, and habitual invariant B is an example 2. And 3, as an example 2 and 3, that count for, together account for 60% of all present tense Be Like quotatives. As the use of the quotative Be Like increased, invariant B became the primary copula form used by Springville speakers to express habituality in Be Like quotatives, and is subsequently spread to non-Be Like quotatives, as you can see, is in number 4, except it does not occur with say. You don't ever find it with I be saying. Okay? So because the Springville Panel Survey consists of recordings with a representative subset of the community that spans 3 decades, we have been able to pinpoint the emergence of features like quotative Be Like that are recent developments in Springville AAVE. Since we are able to identify in real time the emergence of Be Like, we can also identify the principal motivating factor that led to its emergence and rapid spread in the speech of young Springville speakers. In this case, a dramatic demographic shift in the student population that brought an overwhelming non-AAVE speaking population into the school. And we can only speculate about the motivating factors that led to the emergence of habitual invariant B in the community, because the evolution of this form occurred before the panel study began. What we can show, though, is that habitual invariant B and other distinctive features of the AAVE copula auxiliary system were well established in the vernacular in Springville when quotative Be Like first diffused in the community around the mid-1990s, and provided the foundation for the unique architecture of quotative Be Like in Springville AAVE. So the great value of the panel survey then is that it can show exactly how this architecture was created and can begin to address the problem of actuation, perhaps the most difficult problem in the synchronic approach to language change. Don't worry, that's not really a blank slide. The ethnographic approach to fieldwork and the longitudinal nature of the project have also allowed us to document significant demographic shifts in Springville that we show are key to the evolution of AAVE in the community. For example, the rapid growth starting in 1991, as I've already mentioned, of the Springville School due to the influx of students, mostly Anglo and Latino from the neighboring communities, and that fueled the diffusion of innovative forms as Springville children and adolescents extended their peer networks. Some people have passed away, and others have left the community. So sadly, very sadly, the Springville store closed in 2004. Okay, I know, I wanted to buy it. And along with the beer joint, which you can see, it's all boarded up here, right? Which closed shortly thereafter. I don't know what the time frame was on that. And then the post office shut down 10 years later in 2014 after the Union Pacific Railroad bought the property. So here's what we have now. That's the footprint of where the store used to be, right here. And I love this picture. Actually, Guy took this photo. This is Bobby, the guy with the snake. And I love it because it looks, he's just like walking away. It's really metaphoric, in my opinion, anyway. So the rail company has since demolished the store, as you can see, the beer joint and nearby houses, including the house where Vanessa lived. She lived across, there were 2 railroad tracks. The store was sandwiched in between, and then Vanessa lived across one of the tracks. And it's in the process of building a major switching yard on the property, right? But because of my continued presence in the community, we've been able to document the impact of these changes on the linguistic processes that I have described tonight. So Vanessa has moved out of town but close, so that's why I can still go see her. So here's where we got to the recording devices. So in addition to 30 years of fieldwork, we've also worked with 30 years of recording devices. So here's my favorite recording device, right, with that antique dinosaur cassette tape there. Then I graduated to this worse recording device that some of you may have used, right? I have dozens of these discs if anybody needs any, right? And then I went to the, digital age, right? But that's still not very good, and this is what I use now, right? And that's really easy, and really, makes things a lot, I don't have to pack as much stuff when I go to the field, right? And of course, Guy and I have changed over time as well. So here we go. There we are. So there I am in 88, holding a baby, right? Which Guy reminded me who is now over 30 years old. You can also see my trusty TCM 5000 hanging from my shoulder, which is where it was most of the time I was there. And this is Guy here holding one and, doing a recording with somebody just standing up right there. Lots of hair still. Okay. So, and finally, oh, not too bad. I would like to share an excerpt from a 1994 rejection letter I received when we submitted our paper, An Approach to Sociolinguistic Fieldwork, a Site Study of Rural AAVE in a Texas Community, for publication. We all get these, right? It was published the next year. Okay, so this is quote, just a quick excerpt. I have reservations about the approach discussed here. What are the linguistic purposes that can be served by this approach? How much time such an approach must take? How much data must be transcribed? I know that. And its usefulness in wide-ranging situations. Okay, and this was only 6 years into the project when I got that review, right? So some 30 years later, I hope I've been able to dispel these concerns and have shown that my commitment to longitudinal fieldwork and my decision to devote my career to this enterprise was the right decision. I would like to close by reading part of a discussion post from one of my students at the Institute. I don't know if she's here, but I'm not going to call her name out. Okay, so she says, after reading that article that eventually did get published, I would like, you write that you were in the field for 2 months over the course of one summer, but you then return to the field regularly. Dr. Cukor-Avila, when do you know that it's time to leave the field? When do you decide to come back? Of course, here's my answer. I probably am not the right person to answer this, because I can't seem to tear myself away from my field site, or rather the people that I've been recording for 30 years. It's hard for me to say that the fieldwork is over, because I never know what opportunities will arise when I go. Thank you.